Hey everyone, and welcome to this deep dive.
It,
It's all about humility, and it's been a wild ride just getting ready for this. You know what I mean?
I hear you. There's just so much to unpack.
Oh, absolutely. Like, I've got stacks of notes here from biblical texts,
Oh,
Old and New Testament, to this book, Eternal Truths to Live By. We're talking about Proverbs, historical figures, and even some pretty deep theological concepts.
a real journey through time and perspective.
I know, right? And I was thinking, our mission here isn't to just, define humility. It's to really grasp how different folks throughout history have understood it. And then, like, what that means for us now.
Absolutely.
So one thing that really hit me was from New Testament part 2,
Hmm.
the story of John the Baptist. He says, I'm not worthy to untie the thong of his sandal.
Oh, yeah.
Now, some might hear that and think, wow, that's putting himself down. But
Yeah.
to me, it was different.
You know, it is fascinating how John, even while baptizing Jesus, was so aware of his role as a forerunner. It wasn't about self-deprecation. It was about understanding his place in a much bigger story.
So, like, his humility is actually his strength.
Exactly. It's about this idea of being in the right relationship, not just with a deity, but with a purpose that's bigger than yourself.
Okay, I see that. And John understood. His success wasn't about him personally. It was part of something much bigger.
Right.
And that makes me wonder about us. Where do we see those bigger picture moments in our own lives, in our work, our
Mhm.
families, maybe even in those personal goals we have?
It's something to think about, and it brings to mind the challenges of leadership, especially when you consider the quote from Eternal Truths to Live By. It says, "Whoever wants to be a leader among you must be your servant."
It's like a paradox, leading by serving. How does that even work in practice?
Right. It really challenges our usual ideas about power and authority. Like, think about King Herod in New Testament Part 2. He was punished for his pride.
Oh, yeah.
Such a contrast to people like Moses or David in the Old Testament. They had their flaws, for sure, but they were always seeking guidance from something higher.
It really makes you wonder, are there examples of this servant leader model today? Is it just some ideal, or is it actually effective?
Hmm. It's a great question.
Now, something else that really jumped out at me was this emphasis on learning with humility. Like, eternal truths to live by, quotes Proverbs 3.11,
Yeah.
talks about receiving wisdom and instruction from others.
It's a big one. It's not just about gaining knowledge, it's about how we approach learning itself.
So being open to new ideas,
Yeah,
even if they challenge what we already believe.
exactly. And throughout the Bible, there's this focus on listening to different points of view.
Yeah.
Even Jesus, as we see in New Testament Part 1, he engaged in debates and discussions. He was willing to learn from others.
Which makes me think, in this age of everyone having a platform and an opinion, is real intellectual humility dying out? Are we just too quick to dismiss ideas that we don't like?
That's a good point. It goes to the heart of recognizing the limits of our own knowledge.
You know, what really moved me was that passage in New Testament Part 1 about the woman who had been bleeding for years, and she was healed just by touching Jesus' cloak. Talk about faith and humility.
It's a beautiful story. It shows how surrendering to something greater can lead to these powerful experiences. I mean, this woman had been suffering for so long, and yet it was that simple act of faith, her willingness to humble herself, that brought about her healing.
It's almost like by letting go of our ego, we create space for something bigger to work in us.
Exactly. It brings us right back to the idea of humility as strength. John the Baptist's power wasn't from promoting himself. It came from understanding his place in God's plan, just like that woman. His humility allowed him to access a strength that wasn't his own.
Wow, that's a powerful connection. It makes me think, have you ever had a time where setting aside your ego actually led to a surprisingly good outcome?
Hmm. It's definitely worth thinking about. But before we go there, I think we should look at another side of humility, its relationship to vulnerability. You know, we often think of vulnerability as a weakness, but I actually think true humility needs a certain amount of vulnerability.
I can see that. It takes guts to admit when we're not good at something, to ask for help,
Mm.
or say we messed up.
Exactly. And, you know, the sources we're looking at, they really highlight this
Oh,
connection.
really? Like what?
Okay, well, think about that passage in Philippians chapter 2, where it talks about Christ emptying himself, becoming a servant.
Yeah, and ultimately,
He was exalted.
right. And that act of self-emptying, embracing vulnerability and humility, that's where the real power is. It's not about controlling others. It's about giving yourself to a higher purpose.
And it ties in with that story of the woman who was healed. It took so much vulnerability for her to expose her suffering like that, to reach out for healing.
Absolutely. That wasn't weakness. It was courage and trust. Through her humility and vulnerability, she was able to access a power that changed her life.
It makes you wonder if vulnerability is like the key to unlocking our full potential.
That's an interesting thought.
There.
And it connects back to what we were saying about humility and learning.
You mean being open to new ideas,
Yeah.
even the ones that challenge us?
Exactly. When we approach learning with humility and vulnerability, we're more open to different perspectives. We're willing to admit we don't have all the answers. It reminds me of that line from Proverbs 3:5-6 in Eternal Truths. It says, "Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he shall direct your paths."
That's perfect. It's like it's telling us to let go of our limited views and embrace a wisdom that's bigger than us.
In that surrender, it takes vulnerability, right? Being willing to not always be right.
For sure. It's about understanding that we're all part of something much greater than ourselves. And that realization, that humbling awareness of how we're all connected, that can be so freeing.
You know, this conversation keeps coming back to the idea of right relationship, not just with like a higher power, but with each other and even with ourselves.
I think that's the core of humility, understanding where we fit in the grand scheme of things. It's not about making ourselves smaller, but seeing ourselves in the right perspective.
So it's not about denying our strengths, but realizing they're part of a larger picture.
Exactly. And when we get that, it frees us from needing constant validation from the trap of ego. It lets us lead with authenticity and compassion, to learn with openness and curiosity, and to live with a purpose that's bigger than just our own wants.
That's really powerful. It's like humility allows us to be our true selves, not despite our flaws, but because of them.
And that freedom, that liberation from ego, that's where the true power of humility lies.
You know, hearing you talk about all this, I'm reminded of something else from Eternal Truths. It's that quote from Psalm 148.13, "Let them praise the name of the Lord, for his name alone is excellent. His glory is above the earth and heaven."
Such a beautiful passage. What about it made you think of humility?
Well, it's acknowledging something bigger than us, recognizing that we're part of a larger whole. And in that context, humility isn't putting ourselves down. It's celebrating the magnificence of everything, how it's all connected.
I love that. It's like saying humility lets us step outside of our own self-importance and just be amazed by the beauty and complexity of the world.
Exactly. And then humility becomes a source of joy, a way to appreciate life even more.
You know, that reminds me of another point from Eternal Truths that resonated with me. The idea of humility in leadership. You mentioned that quote from Matthew about the leader being a servant.
Right. Whoever wants to be a leader among you must be your servant.
And there's another quote in Eternal Truths that goes perfectly with it from Luke 12:48. It says, "For unto whomsoever much is given of him shall be much required."
I see the connection. It's like saying true leadership isn't about having power. It's about using your gifts and what you've been given to serve others, to make a difference in the world.
Exactly. And that sense of responsibility, realizing that our talents and chances mean we should give back, that's a sign of humble leadership.
So humility is the basis for good and effective leadership, a guiding principle that helps us use our influence for good.
Couldn't have said it better.
Hmm.
And this idea of humility as a moral compass, it's something you find in lots of spiritual traditions, don't you think?
Definitely. And it's not just following rules. It's about having a heart that wants to do right, to be kind and compassionate.
Exactly. It's about seeing our shared humanity and treating everyone with dignity and respect.
You know, thinking about all these different sides of humility, it's obviously not a simple thing. It's complex and has so many layers.
Yeah.
It affects how we live, lead, learn, and relate to the world.
And yet, in a way, it's also very simple. It's about knowing our place in the grand scheme of things, about giving ourselves over to something bigger, and about living a life of service, compassion, and gratitude.
I like that. It's like saying humility is the key to a deeper, more meaningful way of life.
And it's a journey that needs constant work, self-reflection, and a willingness to challenge our own ego.
Speaking of challenges, there's one more thing I wanted to touch on before we wrap up this deep dive. How does humility help us when we're dealing with tough situations or setbacks?
That's a great question. And it makes us think about how humility guides us through the ups and downs that everyone faces. It's like, life throws everyone a curveball every now and then. So how does humility help us in those tough spots?
Yeah, like when things get really hard.
Well, think about it. When we get knocked down, humility helps us get back up.
So we don't get stuck in blaming others or feeling sorry for ourselves.
Right. Humility lets us own our mistakes, learn from them, and move on.
So it's not about never messing up. It's about how we react when we do.
Exactly. It's about having the courage to admit when we're wrong, to ask for help, and to see challenges as opportunities to grow.
It makes me think of that quote from Eternal Truths, Proverbs 24:16. It says, "For though the righteous fall 7 times, they rise again, but the wicked stumble when calamity strikes."
That's powerful imagery. It's not about being perfect. It's about resilience. It's about having the humility to pick ourselves up and keep going.
It reminds me of what we were talking about earlier, the link between humility and vulnerability.
Oh, yeah. When we face setbacks, it's tempting to try and protect our ego, to act like we've got it all figured out.
But that just makes us feel alone, right?
You got it. Humility lets us be vulnerable, to admit we're struggling and to reach out for help.
And when we do that, we actually build stronger connections with other people.
For sure. When we're willing to show our own imperfections, it gives others the okay to do the same. It creates this feeling of shared humanity.
It's like we're all in this together, going through the ups and downs of life.
Absolutely. And that shared experience, realizing we're all human, it can be so comforting and empowering.
So we've looked at humility from all these different angles, its role in leadership, learning, relationships, even how we deal with challenges.
We've seen how it's not about weakness or putting ourselves down, but about strength, wisdom, connection, and ultimately living a more fulfilling life.
So what does it all mean for us? How can we actually become more humble in our lives?
Well, I think the first step is awareness. Noticing those times when pride or ego get in the way.
Like when we're more concerned with being right than understanding someone else's point of view.
Yeah, and then it's about consciously choosing humility over ego, even in small everyday interactions.
Things like choosing to listen instead of interrupting, admitting when we're wrong, or simply asking for help.
Those are all great examples. It's about practicing humility as a way of life, not just a one-time thing.
So it's a journey, a constant process of looking inward and growing.
Absolutely. And it's a journey worth taking because, as we've seen in this deep dive, humility can really change our lives and make the world a better place.
You've given us so much to think about. Any last words for our listeners?
Yeah, I think it comes down to this. If humility unlocks so much good in our lives, why do we often resist it? What are we so scared of? What would it take for us to truly embrace the power of humility? That's something I'd love for you all to ponder.
That's a powerful thought to leave us with. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into humility. Until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep cultivating that essential quality of humility.